20 years after it invaded Afghanistan in the aftermath of the September 11, 2001 multiple terrorist attacks on America, the United States is set to withdraw all its troops by the 20th anniversary of those attacks, this September 11th. President Joe Biden is scheduled to formally announce the troop withdrawal this afternoon. With that, America intends to end its longest war, whose gains have at best been questionable and at worst a staggering failure, with over 2,300 US troops killed in Afghanistan and over 20,000 injured, not to mention hundreds of billions of dollars having been spent on the forever war. To understand what the troop withdrawal might mean for the future of Afghanistan, MCR spoke to Anwar Iqbal, the Washington correspondent of Pakistan's Dawn newspaper and one of the most respected observers of Afghanistan, who has extensively traveled and reported from that country. Here is Anwar Iqbal.
First, give me a broad stroke impression of how you see the deal because you are a veteran of Afghanistan. What do you think is going to happen now?
See, this was expected. First of all, there is a general acceptance of the fact here in Washington that they cannot stay in Afghanistan forever, and that the U.S. presence will, at the best, keep the status quo. It's not going to improve the situation, but it can, at the best, it can keep the status quo. Number two, they also had started saying that the Afghan government, that the Afghan forces and Afghan civil society should take responsibility for their country, and it's not our job to do their work. It is for them to put their country on the right path. We can only help. And many Americans used to complain that, okay, I mean, like, we are helping, but they're not doing anything. So there was what you may call an engagement fatigue, and it is to be expected. Almost 20 years, and this is the longest ever American involvement in any country. So you cannot expect America to stay there forever. That is one thing. The other thing is that despite this realization, the Americans are either cannot, I think cannot, rather they do not. They probably do want to, but they cannot do what is needed, which is to somehow arrange an understanding among Afghanistan's neighbors to promote peace and stability in Afghanistan. Unless that happens, there can never be peace in Afghanistan. Right now, what happens? Pakistan, India, Iran, Uzbekistan, Russia, to some extent, even Tajikistan, they all have their proxies in Afghanistan. And they protect their interest by engaging Afghan factions and using them to fight for their interests. For instance, the Pakistanis feel that if the Indians, or rather, whenever the Indians have influence in Pashtun areas, they start. We start having explosions. We start having armed groups. We start having demands for separation in KP, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and Balochistan. The Indians feel that whenever Pakistan has an upper hand in Afghanistan, uh, particularly in Pashtun areas, but also in non-Pashtun areas, then it uses it to create problems for India. So similarly, Iranians feel that unless and until they protect the Persian speaking and the Shia groups in Iran, they will be vulnerable to happenings in Afghanistan. So they want to make sure that the Persian speakers, particularly the Shias, are not only safe, but that they maintain a close link with Iran. Remember one thing: lot of Afghans and Pakistani Shias fought in Syria along with Iranian volunteer forces. Okay,
Right.
so naturally it is a major handle of influence for Iran, which Iran uses to its full extent. So all these three countries keep sort of, in a way, I think, consciously or unconsciously, contribute to keeping Afghanistan destabilized. And so, unless there is some understanding among, particularly among these three, but also Russia, also Uzbekistan, because Uzbekistan has a lot of influence on Dostum and in northern Afghanistan, in Juzjan area, and the Uzbek are considered the fiercest fighting force inside Afghanistan, and although they are small, but they occupy a key city, Mazar Sharif, and which is the second largest city. So having them on board is also important.
Right. Tell me something. America never really is known to leave a place once it enters. There may be some diminishment in the troop level, but in terms of the American influence in Afghanistan, like it's happened in most places where the US goes to, it's really not going to go away. They are going to keep 3,000 troops still, right?
I don't know. I mean, keeping troops will not help. You see, uh, uh, I mean, they can keep some troops if they want. That will only mean having for Taliban and others who are against America, only mean having a target to attack from time to time. It will not achieve much, but American influence will remain. American influence always stays even after America leaves. Like America left Afghanistan, but Vietnam, but America still has a lot of influence in Vietnam.
Right.
Everybody wants which is very strange. It's very strange. They want American influence. They want American money. They want the American way of life, but they do not want physical presence. That's it.
Right.
So I think even Pakistanis, although they are sort of supporting the Taliban demand that the Americans leave, but they actually do not want the Americans to leave. They want some presence in American presence in Pakistan, Afghanistan. They want even some troops to stay, and they definitely want the American influence to continue because they see that as a balancing factor. The Indians also do not want Americans to leave. Perhaps, I mean, I would say that even the Iranians would not be very happy to see the American leave because then they would be required to play to get to have a deeper involvement in Afghanistan affairs than they do now, and that is something that the Iranians may not like either. So it's a very complicated and a very weird situation.
Yeah. One of the conditions of the agreement in 2020 between the US and the Taliban was that the Taliban sever ties with Al Qaeda permanently. Do you think that, number one, that's feasible? And number two, do you think they will really do that?
There is nothing to gain from Al Qaeda anymore for anyone. You have also been to Afghanistan, and because we live in Pakistan, and Pakistan has more Pashtuns than Afghanistan does, and Karachi is now the largest Afghan Pashtun city in the world, and Karachi is where my family lives. So we have been used to living with the Pashtuns, and they are very practical people, very practical and very rational in certain things. I mean, they fight, but they do not commit suicide. You see, fight is a perpetual thing. They're if they're not fighting others, they're fighting among themselves. But they always have a strategy. They even fight within families. They will build huge walls. They actually will build bunkers and even bring machine guns and sometimes rocket propelled grenades and all those things to in fight between two families. You see,
Mhm.
and the fight between two tribes is even larger, and fight against, of course, Russia or America is much larger. But you can never blame Pashtuns for not taking all the necessary steps to fight well. Okay, so what will they get out of Al Qaeda now? Nothing. Al Qaeda, the Bin Laden family has gone. Al Qaeda has no money. Al Qaeda has no support. Uh, Even Muslim governments, those who might have been supporting them quietly, even they have withdrawn their support. So there is nothing to be gained from it. So I think, having known the Afghan mindset, I think Taliban will not be reluctant to do away with Al-Qaeda.
So essentially, the US intelligence assessment that Afghanistan is no longer sort of an existential threat to the US directly, that's a fair assessment, right?
I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the Taliban would not want to continue engage with Al Qaeda. They have separated and they will move away from it. As far as using Afghanistan for launching another attack, another 9/11 like attack on the United States, I think that's unlikely to happen for many reasons. And the first and foremost is that the Americans are careful now. What happened on 9/11 was unexpected. They will not let that happen. Number two, other countries have seen the consequences. Pakistan has seen the consequences. Afghanistan has seen the consequences of this thing. The Russians have the Chinese do not want any trouble. They don't want. They definitely do not want Muslim religious groups to become strong in Afghanistan because that will have a direct impact on Xinjiang. So I think that America, I mean, there will not be another 9/11 like attack, but any country which is as fragmented as Afghanistan, any country which has so many interest groups involved, so many external actors involved, that country will always remain vulnerable for exploitations by all sorts of elements.
There has been some return to democracy in Afghanistan, and I was reading a story in the New York Times where it quotes ordinary people to say that they are rather worried that once the US umbrella is taken off, they don't know what might happen to the small roots that democracy has struck there. What's your assessment once the Taliban begins to have a major foothold in governance? What do you think that might do?
Mine, look at your own statement. I mean, what the Afghans are saying that democracy has started taking foothold, but it will not stay if the Americans leave. So, what sort of democracy is that?
Well, that's the dichotomy of Afghanistan.
Okay, yeah, that is it. So the problem, you can say that democracy, I don't know. I mean, in a tribal society, as tribal as Afghanistan is, democracy is there in their own form of democracy. I mean, a tribal society is very democratic, where decisions have always been taken in consultations among what they call mashar, or the
Right.
elders of the tribe, and that form which existed in the subcontinent as panchayat. So that democracy is there and is strong and will stay. Western parliamentary democracy will take time. I mean, the good thing about democracy is that when you put people on the path of elections and forming political parties, bringing out newspapers, running campaigns, so the process grows its own roots, and it is very difficult to undo it. So that will stay, but will it lead to the type of democracy that we see in the West? That I think it will take a long, long time. That is not going to happen in the near future.
But it may not even be necessary once peace prevails. It doesn't matter what form of democracy they practice, right? It does not necessarily have to be parliamentary in the fashion of, say, in India or Britain or in Pakistan or elsewhere. As long as they follow peaceful ways, what difference does it make?
No, it is. I mean, for the Afghan middle class, it does. To them, it does make a lot of difference because they want to have a say. And in a tribal setup, the middle class is almost voiceless. You see,
That's true.
it's always the tribal chiefs and tribal elders who wield all the power. So obviously, for the Afghan middle class, it is very important to have a setup in which they have a say. See, we have this problem in Pakistan too. I mean, Pakistan is definitely in this respect better than Afghanistan, but at the same time, compared to India, democracy is weaker in Pakistan because we have very strong tribal traditions in KP, in Balochistan, in Sindh, even in some areas of Punjab, and therefore democracy. You will. I mean, one long time ago, an Indian journalist asked me why, whenever an elected government is toppled, why the change is welcomed in Pakistani cities, why people take out processions in the streets in favor of the military takeover. And I
Yeah.
said that is something you need to understand. The thing is, when you have elections, when you have democracy, those who get elected in Pakistan are the ones who are very, very rich and influential. These are tribal chiefs. These are big jagirdars. These are like traditional peers, and these are the people that ordinary people have no access to. And when the army takes over, what do you do? What you end up having is army officers. The ordinary people have to deal with. They don't have to deal with generals. They have to deal with captains and majors, at the most a colonel. And
Right.
most of these captains and majors and colonels are from lower middle class families who get education, get commission, and become army officers. So what happens when you have a military takeover in Pakistan? That these middle class people have a greater access to the corridors of power than they do in democracy, and that's why they welcome it.
How do you see the exit of the US troops and perhaps Taliban making even deeper inroads? What do you think it might do to the overall governance structure in Afghanistan?
Uh, Afghanistan, I mean, I think Afghanistan needs some sort of setup in Kabul to continue, and the Taliban takeover of Kabul will be a setback. There should
Mhm.
be Taliban should become a part of the ruling elite, but they should not take over. And there should be a consensus among Afghans to have representation from every segment of the society, every tribal group, every ethnic group, and of course, it will not happen tomorrow, but that should be the ultimate. Okay, so uh, the danger is that the U.S. withdrawal may cause the collapse of the government in Kabul. Even during the Soviet invasion or before that, the government in Kabul meant the government in Kabul and some major cities. The federal government or the central government never had much of an influence in the rural areas. So the rural areas were always semi-independent, which is how they would remain. But uh, I mean, the Americans and the entire international community, including India and Pakistan, should work to promote a representative setup in Kabul if they want peace and stability in Afghanistan. That is the only option, I think.
Right. How do you see India and Pakistan playing out once the US troops leave Afghanistan? Do you think they'll jostle to have their own spheres of influence, or are they in a
Apparently,
position
they
to work
will.
together?
Apparently, they will because they still have not been able to even start talking to each other. Unless they start talking to each other, they cannot really reach an understanding on anything. I mean, even for an understanding on Afghanistan, they need to talk to each other. They need to be very open that look, these are our interests in Afghanistan, and this is what we want. And the other side also has to put its card on the table, and they should then come to an understanding. That I don't see that happening in the near future.
But a subset of that is the recent promise of a thaw, which never really took place between India and Pakistan. What do you
Yeah.
think happened? Why do you think Imran Khan reversed course on that?
See, Pakistan in that sense, Pakistani society, unfortunately, in the Pakistani society, group interests, factional interests, party interests prevail over national interests.
Mhm.
So, say, had it be PPP or PMLN, they would have done the same thing that Imran did if they were they were in power, because whoever is in power comes to the realization that unless you engage with India, unless you improve relations with India, things will never move. And those who oppose it within the establishment, within the political setup, in the opposition, everywhere, they also know that this is something that has to be done. But because they see it as an opportunity to attack the government, so people who have their scores to settle, they also exploit this issue. And by that I do not only mean political parties, but people within the establishment too. And that is why efforts to improve ties with India never go anywhere.
I had asked the former National Security Advisor John Bolton recently whether he thought the Biden administration had leaned on the two countries to begin some sort of negotiation, and he said he sees no sign of that. What's your sense of that?
I think they did. I think they did use the influence. They still are using it, and they want India and Pakistan to start talking. But for that to happen, you see, the Kashmir dispute has also become a major industry in both countries. There's a lot of money to be made from it too, you see, and there are interest groups, not just money, but there are interest groups whose existence is tied to Kashmir. So while there are many on both sides who would like this to be resolved, there are others who do not want it to be resolved. So I had hope, but it didn't happen, that the growth of the middle class, particularly in India, and the influence of the internet, the social media, and everything, will will empower the people who didn't have much of a say in the traditional media or in a traditional political setup, and they will have a positive influence on both India and Pakistan. But that too is not happening.
Yeah.
Those people probably have become even more sort of anti each other than the traditional political classes were. So I don't know. For that, the thing is, both sides have this what we call poison in their system, and unless this poison is taken out, things will not improve. So something has to happen to allow this poison to ooze out of our systems.
Right, right. Last couple of questions. One is you mentioned the Afghan middle class. Do you think in the last 20 years of the US presence, it has grown enough to have some say in national affairs? And if the US leaves, what do you think that might do to them?
It has grown. I don't know if it is strong enough to have an influence, but it has. I mean, it is much bigger than what it used to be 20 years ago. That is the beauty of, you can say, capitalism. That it does create a middle class because it needs to have a middle class for it to
Right.
prosper. So, if international engagement remains, if money keeps coming in, and if jobs are created, this middle class will grow stronger. Otherwise, what will happen? Most of them will leave Afghanistan, and things will be back where they were before the US invasion.
Right. And finally, what is your expectation of the Taliban making a go for Kabul to control centrally? And if that happens, you've already said that may not be a good sign.
I think to do that, the Taliban will need some support from both inside and outside. This time, that support may not be forthcoming because nobody wants Taliban to have total control over Kabul. They
Including
want,
Pakistan.
it's true for Pakistan too. They do not want Taliban to have full control in Kabul. They want Taliban to be a part of the ruling establishment. They want Taliban to have influence, but because having Taliban in Afghanistan would have its repercussions on Pakistan too. So
True.
Pakistan does not want that either. So unless and until the say what do you call the Abdullah group and the other group, the Pashtuns who are in power, President Ashraf Ghani's group, they start fighting, and other, as it happened after the Soviet withdrawal. So if they start fighting among each other, all these groups who are in power, then they will make it easier. It will make it easier for the Taliban to come. But if they stay intact, they can get enough support from outside to manage to stay in power.